Okay, great. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Attire Seminar Series, hosted by the Institute for Humanities in Africa, that's HUMA, at University of Cape Town. And in today's seminar series, we're very happy to host Patience Mususa from the Nordic Africa Institute in Sweden, where Patience has been a senior researcher since 2015. And Patience grew up on the Copper Belt in Zambia. And the subject of her seminar today is a chapter from her forthcoming book, which is coming out in October this year, called There Used to Be Order, and which focuses on the social life of residents of the Copper Belt in Zambia and the consequences of reprivatization of the mines. And in the book chapter that was distributed for this seminar, which is titled "You Can't Plan: Dreams, Practice, and Order," Patience takes us on an autobiographical or autoethnographic, perhaps, journey into buying a house and learning about the structures of life in the Copper Belt. And Patience describes it in part as you could almost be described as an apprenticeship into the social life of the Copper Belt. And I also thought the title of this chapter could almost be a description of our last year for most of us. You can't plan. But thank you very much. I really enjoyed reading this chapter. It's lucid writing and this personal account and some very interesting observations about social structures. So yeah, I think would be familiar to people from this part of the world in terms of precariousness and ways of trying, and this concept of wayfaring, which appears through it, of people finding their way through their circumstances. So thank you very much, Patience, and thanks everyone who is here. And Patience, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you, Ralph, for such a lovely introduction. The book project, actually, a large part of it arose out of my PhD dissertation that started at the University of Cape Town. So it's fantastic to be invited by the Institute of Humanities in Africa to present on this chapter and broadly the book project. So it's a pleasure. So I will go right into it. So There Used to Be Order stems out of, as Ralph mentioned, my experience of sort of thinking through and trying to make sense on how place changed and the sort of texture of place shifted and changed on the Zambian Copper Belt, where I grew up. And this was catalyzed by the sale of the state-owned mining conglomerate, the Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines, which in the mid-1990s left the majority of the town's residents anxious to make a living and to sustain a life. The book project focuses on the issue of middle class or middle income decline. And it looks at how residents in this part of Zambia, the Zambian Copper Belt, which has been written and has been the focus of sort of many studies of social and urban change. It focuses on the transformation in this sort of new phase of sort of neoliberal capitalism and structural adjustment. So if you just give me a moment just to order that. So there's a dearth of descriptive material about material and social differentiation and coping during the transition period to a market-based economy in Zambia and beyond. Recently, a number of anthropologists have warned against the trend towards highly theoretical work with little empirical content and have called for a return to ethnographic description as a useful endeavor on its own. And so this study moves in this direction, and it resonates with previous ethnographies. For example, many people will be familiar with James Ferguson's Expectations of Modernity, and a lot of the works of the Copperbelt to Manchester School scholars such as Epstein, Powdermaker, who contributed to study on everyday life in towns and cities. More recently, it speaks to and resonates with works that have looked at improvisational livelihoods following sort of post-structural adjustment policies, and in particular in the context of the collapse of states following the end of the Cold War period. So for example, here thinking about people like Abdul Malik Simon, the work of people like Edgar Peterson, Charles Piot, and it also draws on the theoretical insights of place and placemaking from anthropology and human geography and urban studies. And what I attempt to do in the book effectively is to to continue this tradition of Copperbelt studies, but effectively describe the changing texture of place, and describe not just sort of social variation and change, but the context within which it occurs. And what I also attempt to do by a focus on place and placemaking is a focus on stories. And an aspect of particularly when one sort of looks at earlier studies on the Copperbelt, there was a sort of tendency to sort of focus on the categorizations of what was happening within society, and there was much less of a focus on how people described the experiences of this specific changes. And so I'll just try and see if I can share a screen just to. So I've just placed the slide there just to give you a sense of how and what, when Copperbelt residents said that there used to be order, and they'll use the Bemba lingua franca sort of mixed English, so sequali order. And they'll draw on that term to describe the sort of changing material setting. So you have an image of the recreational club, for example, in the Copperbelt town of Luanshire, with overgrown grass. It was rusting, sort of falling apart. And you also have sort of changing livelihoods and lifestyles, where suddenly mine workers and mine workers' families, a greater number of them had to enter the informal economy and sort of organize their livelihood. So you have an image of one of the sort of front yard stores in this middle income neighborhood. And the setting for this was that for many Copperbelt residents, many of them could not conceive of a time when the mining industry would slow down or come to a halt, or you would have the kind of disruptions that occurred following the privatization. And the idea was that for many people, when privatization happened, their thought was that they would have a sort of new and sort of better life, an improvement on their circumstances. They did not conceive that it would be a cataclysmic change, with 2/3 of the population losing their jobs and being forced into the informal economy, and sort of trying to chart out this life in a context where there was prospects for a small number, to sort of start making money within this sort of newly opened up market economy, while for the majority, it was really a sort of struggle for survival. So what this did is that it created sort of like two conditions, sort of all occurring in one setting, which in the sort of small snippet of chapter 2 that I sent, is the sort of notion of sort of both hope and despair. where on one hand, people felt this sort of sense of uncertainty in sort of trying to manage everyday life, struggling to sort of make plans in this sort of context of uncertainty. At the same time, there was still a sense that this sort of a sense of hope that I argue was not necessarily just anchored in the possibilities of the present, but was anchored in the possibilities of how people had imagined, from the past, and how imagined what the future would look like. And this, to some extent, an image or an imaginary of the future that was out of step with the realities within which they were living in, but which I argue allowed them to sort of create an anchor for their improvisational activities, effectively to try, to sort of try to make a living and to sort of try to make it. Within the setting. And so what I do, and I sort of describe across the other chapters of the of the book, is effectively from the perspective of what people do, sort of drawing on these sort of phenomenological perspectives in anthropology and human geography, is to sort of take a man in the world perspective, so i.e. and place that within a context of doing. And that's where I describe the process in that particular chapter of trying to buy a place on the Copper Belt, fixing it up, and the kinds of and how that sort of direct engaged participation provides some insight into how other Copper Belt residents are living in the present, but also how they are trying to formulate plans within a context which many people would argue is characterized by uncertainty. And I'll just and so theoretically, where this places the work effectively is a critique of agency. So, like in sort of a lot of the work and writings about agency in anthropology, the whole idea that people sort of have a grip and they can sort of make decisions and make some kind of linear plan about where things go. But by rooting agency within a specific material environment and seeing what it is that the material environment affords, I make a case that what people do in their sort of wayfaring, iterative efforts of trying to make a living is also effortful. It comes up against the very surface and texture of the context within which they are in, which in turn also shapes their subjectivities and their experience of the specific context. So if we then also have to draw from the sort of, in anthropology, sort of this critique as well of the whole idea that you can sort of neatly categorize what happens, some of the tensions that you find in particular within sort of, some of the structuralist thinking within anthropology, and all what you then get for Copper Belt residents in this sort of iterative improvisational efforts, they would chuff against that idea of sort of rigid structures or descriptions that sort of neatly delineate what the possibilities are. And they would make a case for arguing to sort of seeing the areas where things sort of fall outside or spill over the sort of structural boundaries, that give rise to surprise. And that in itself links in back to Ingalls' work, in particular his work on lines, where he effectively talks about this sort of how effectively inscriptive practices of objectification could also be seen as sort of learning processes. And also, as sort of people attempt to make sense of their lives in a context of uncertainty, they're also learning along the process as they sort of learn the surface and texture of the context within which they are operating in. So within the setting, it's not that sort of Copperbelt residents give up the notion of a plan completely, but that the notion of a plan and trying to make living in a context of uncertainty becomes more like a guide to some extent, that one travels along and learns along, but keeping it open enough to this sort of notion of the free spirit. And here I draw from, sort of Renee Willis's sort of thinking, well, what is a good theory? So if Copperbelt residents, for example, are sort of thinking and sort of theorizing and analyzing to say, well, how does one make a possibility of a life in a context where it's difficult to organize and to make things? They're operating effectively at two currents. One, and one would say sort of more or less the sort of classical that provides some loose sense of structure. And on one other hand, the sense of the romantic, where one provides a sort of wayfaring, where one sort of comes off the path. And it was in this context that it provided the context for them to make connections, to create networks, to be able to carve out a life by keeping things relatively open at the same time. And within this kind of sort of like dwelling or living within the environment, it's the way in which they sort of told stories of a place and landscape in terms of what they anchored, what was so stable, was in understandings of what it was like in the past. So you had this sort of sense and notion of nostalgia, when in the past there used to be order, and this sort of sense of nostalgia would be what Williams, for example, would refer to as sort of structure of feeling, one that sort of links into this idea of place and rhythms, but at the same time, a structure of place and rhythms that links in to the sort of political context within which activities occurred. So in this context, the setting of this big state mining conglomerate that provided a setting for stable jobs for a majority of its residents, and then with privatization, of course, a setting of uncertainty. And so in describing the way in which people are now forced to make a living, the way in which the environment has changed, it speaks and provides meaning and value to this changed context, sort of broadly describing a sort of a structure of feeling. And this is where I argue that sort of earlier on, that it departs from the work of people like James Ferguson and others who did a really sort of excellent account of describing the sense of dashed expectations on the Copperbelt, but this was not necessarily anchored into how people experience the texture of place and what they were doing in their everyday lives. And so in the subsequent chapters, in particular in chapter 3 of the book, I describe how also class differentiations that sort of emerged following privatization, where some people were doing clearly much better off and the majority were not, allows to a sort of speaking to this sort of changed sense of how and why some people were doing better than others, but also to the kinds of livelihood activities that they started engaging in, and how it affected how they were able to feed themselves, nourish themselves, and the kind of activities that they were able to do. And in the chapter 4, linking in broadly also to the sort of changed landscape and context, I describe the establishment of informal mining activities. And here it's the sort of visions of women and children effectively scavenging at mining dumps to be able to sort of try to sell flagstone, either to sort of as a building material component, and others increasingly as sort of copper prices have gone up to sort of feed into sort of global commodity flows. And speaking to the same sort of changed and sort of not just texture, but also rhythms and itineraries, the book draws on popular culture, in particular music, to effectively to sort of provide a setting for how Copperbelt residents make sense of the changed context, but also speaking to the much more sort of affective dimension of living in a context of uncertainty, where they urge each other to go on, effectively urge each other to try within a context where it's very, very difficult, and they're living within a context of death and uncertainty. And it is here, effectively, when one looks at the sort of iterative practices of trying and trying to plan, that the work of social thinkers like Povinelli and others also come in sort of useful, because it sort of interlinks sort of biopolitics with the everyday practice of living occurring within a specific context. And sort of to close off before we, I guess, take some questions from the people who read the chapter, is I guess it's sort of thinking much more broadly about the nature of structural adjustment policies and neoliberalism in Africa. Whereas, you know, you've had quite a number of studies, for example, you know, talking about post-industrial decline in the American Rust Belt, talking about the sort of context of uncertainty in Eastern Europe following the collapse, you know, the end of the Cold War, and all, and how people sort of tried to make sense of life there, and all, and within the sort of, given the sort of long run of, I would say, sort of protracted austerity policies in Africa, the book effectively is a contribution to sort of telling the stories of how it was experienced beyond the sort of governance questions that one tends to sort of find dominate a lot of sort of social studies and thinking of the political economy of African countries and settings.
Thank you very much, Patience. Yeah, great. We're going to open to questions. I'll just respond to the last part of what you were saying, just to kick off. So, when you're calling attention to the effect of globalization and neoliberalism in Africa through structural adjustment programs, and we were talking before the seminar started about parallels with Zimbabwe, where I also grew up, and recounting our own structural adjustment programs that were instituted by the IMF and the World Bank, and how you could see this gap opening between rich and poor in the country. And as you say, when people talk about places like Zimbabwe and other African countries, they draw attention to the governance issues, as you referred to, which I take to mean things like corruption and ways in which the decline of some African countries would be located there, and probably not enough attention paid to the role of global financial institutions in the 80s and 90s and beyond in starting to have those kinds of widening inequalities take place in those countries. And I know that there are geographers like, say, Patrick Bond, who lived in Zimbabwe and documented the effects of economic structural adjustment programs. But as you say, your book can make an important contribution to this, because the South is a sandbox for interventions from the North that then are then re-imported back to Europe and America. So I think in some ways, the adjustments that were made to economies in Africa were then tried out later and more recently in Europe and Britain and America. And that's why we're also seeing now some of the same patterns of inequality and austerity in those places. So yeah, I think it's great to see your book and to know that that's coming out later this year. So if people would like to raise their emoji hands, and then we'll see that you want to ask a question. That would be one way of identifying yourselves. So I'll just give it a minute and see, are there any questions for patients?
Yeah, while we're waiting for sort of a hand to come up, you make a good point, because the Comoros made a similar point about how Euro-America is evolving towards Africa, and I think that's why also sort of being attentive to the ways in which structural adjustment policies played out on the ground, and in particular thinking about middle income decline, provides a setting for a place for context of a conversation of a relational comparison with other settings. A call that people like Jennifer Robinson make a case for as well, to say, well, how do we then put these a different geographical context into conversation? What are the points of entry? And the focus on place and the kinds of dynamics of what happens with structural adjustment, liberalization, privatization might provide an entry point for that.
Yes, and when you call attention to middle income decline, as you referred to in your talk and in your book, I mean, that does seem to point to the way that the middle class seems to be under threat around the world. This idea of the middle is evaporating or being eroded, and we're moving more into the extremes of extreme wealth and extreme poverty, and that middle band is starting to disappear. Yeah, and I was also very interested in your account of agency. When you talk about the Comoros, I was part of a study group called Global Arenas of Knowledge, which looked at Southern theory, Raywin Connell's book called Southern Theory, which is also a kind of a companion to the Comoros book of Theory from the South as well. And we also talked in those groups about the idea of Southern agency, which is having agency in the face of disadvantage, and how people, researchers and research institutions too, express their agency in these interesting ways in response to their circumstances. So I see two. I see first of all Dominique in the chat, and then following that Eliseo Makamo, who I think is an upcoming Attire seminar speaker. So great to see you here. But Dominique asks, is there any new enchantment that the nostalgia for past order conjures? Is that a term that you're familiar with? New enchantment?
I mean, yes. I mean, to a large extent that there is, and it's almost the sort of the site where there's this sort of what is sort of seemingly the fantastical and all sort of comes into play, like, in a context where you have the sort of constraints within a current context, the idea of a possibility, that the idea that something might work out might be sort of further afield. So why not sort of cast the net much further and much wider? And I think there's also a political component to that as well, because I mean, some people sort of caution against the sort of whole notion of nostalgia sort of linking to also kind of much more like, in particular, when one looks at the sort of Zambian copper belt, the sort of heyday of the state-owned mining conglomerate was also under context of a one-party state and limited freedoms, in terms of limited freedoms for expression and all. But at the same time, you have people like Raymond Williams and others effectively talking to the sort of what you call it, the multi-layered structures of feelings as well, that hint to also the possibilities that lie, whether it's in a call for a welfare orientation. Again, when people say, well, they don't have access to certain services, or certain services are not maintained anymore, they don't have the same recreational lifestyles. And within those particular stories, one also finds the sense of the political calls that in oftentimes now when one talks about sort of neoliberal politics, they say, well, there's no sort of alternatives, there's nothing really comes up, but the political actually exists in these stories linking to the past.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I see a follow from Divine, but I'm going to go to Alicia, as he has his hand up there. And Alicia, I'll also invite you to, if you feel like turning on your video, exactly, that would be great. Welcome.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you, Patience, for a very interesting presentation. My question is about what you said towards the end, and also in response to Ralph. And it's really about whether what you are witnessing in Zimbabwe and Zambia, or what we are witnessing in Africa, is really a repetition of what happened elsewhere, or what's going to happen in Europe is a replay of what happened in Africa, or whether we are witnessing the exhaustion of a model. And if that is the case, whether we do not have the duty to actually start inventing a new vocabulary to think about what is happening in our countries, and not be imprisoned by a model that is perhaps exhausted, in the sense that it doesn't allow us to see possibilities opening up in this situation that countries face in Africa. So it's really a question about what the object of our observation is here, if we are really observing what's happening in our countries, or whether we are simply describing a model. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. Over to you, Patience.
No, that's a very, very important observation, because in the last chapter of the book, actually, it sort of raises a similar question to, effectively making a case that, in particular now, as even in the sort of broader political context that the continent sort of charts is industrialization, structural transformation, recovery plans, is that where should we be looking for the alternatives? So beyond the sort of structural neoliberal sort of critique, maybe in those activities that people are doing and organizing and finding means and ways within which to plan and organize a life within quite constrained circumstances are the places that might provide a scaffolding for a future. And that taking those sites and thinking around that seriously offers a potential space.
Thank you, Patience. Yeah, I'm going to go to Nick. I wanted to have a partial response to Alicia, which is, I think maybe I'm thinking along practical grounds of the actual programmatic economic interventions that were started by the Chicago School and were tried in Argentina and then were, tried out in different locations. So I think there is a specific economic program that moves to different countries in the world and tries out a set of approaches. So, but I do get the wider point that you're making there. So thank you. Minga Congo, would you like to ask a question?
Yes. Thank you so much, Patience, for such wonderful contribution. The reason why I'm going to ask, I don't know if this can be a comment or a question. Being born at the border of Zambia and the DRC, it's very nostalgic to see your book, just the title itself, saying that there used to be order. It captured my attention quite a lot because I recall when I was a child, my mom used to leave me with a neighbor and cross to Zambia and go and buy stuff. That was during Kahunda's period, So now the question that the title of the book itself, when you talk about there used to be order, though I didn't read the book, I'm looking forward to read the book. I would like to understand the concept or the idea behind the title of the used to be order, because we recall the Zambian political scene when Chiluba came on power. I think he's the main contributor to this privatization of the mine, if I recall well. So he's the one who drove that campaign of, we need to privatize the mining sector with his political party called the MMD, if I'm not mistaken. So now when we look at both, during Chiluba's time, and again, when Chiluba came on power, it was a time where many Zambians hoped for change, thinking that, Kaunda has messed up everything. Now we have a democracy in Zambia where we need to now be aspired to this new ideology of democracy, which has become problematic with many Zambians, whereby there's now retrenchment because of privatization. There's what you call informal sector booming, in a sense that, the way you explain to the audience. But what I need to understand is the idea of when you say there used to be order, and also looking at democracy, because Chiluba brought democracy that came with what we call privatization of the mining. And now during Kahunda, there was no, are you saying that, during that particular period, is that what you're referring, that, there used to be order in that sense, or there used to be, there's no order because we have a democracy? So I'm trying to if you can clarify that, which I'll be more than happy to follow. But I have so many questions which I'm not going to be able to ask, because I need to also give other people a chance to ask some question. Thank you.
Thank you, Minga.
Yeah, no, thanks, Minga. Actually, so it's a really good observation, because people refer to the Kaunda era, but in particular, actually, the mining system. And it's sort of corporate paternal welfare orientation that was established, sort of consolidated largely around the sort of mid 1950s on the copper belt, but it's largely also the sort of the Kaunda era. But what it speaks to actually is the point that I can see within the chat that Fiona, who was actually my PhD supervisor, so it's lovely to see you there, Fiona, is this notion of experimentation and improvisation, is that within the sort of deregulated context of privatization, in terms of how people sort of went about trying to make a life, increasingly sort of relied heavily on this notion of trespassing boundaries, because you had a regulatory context that had been weakened in a context of minimal welfare, where social services had been cut back, and people had to sort of make their lives as this sort of like went alone and effectively organize a lot of that on their own. So when they speak to the notion of there was order, it's one, is a link to their past, but it also comments largely on their contemporary, on the contemporary setting and their contemporary lives. The whole notion that nothing really sort of follows a neat, tidy, linear plan. There's multiple variations opened up by deregulation. In that context, they have to, the moral boundaries of what would have regulated sort of moral norms have been shaking, because between having to make money or make a living to get some food, and it's much more primary than following a sort of, so like in the chapter around sort of people working on informal copper mining dump sites, and economic activity that expanded following the privatization. People make a case to say that, you eat, or you get embarrassed to be able to eat. And it speaks to this sort of notion of both order, but also the fact that people have to navigate and improvise a living in these settings.
Thank you, Patience. And I see Catherine McKenzie has their hand up. And please go ahead.
Thank you. I've just put my video on. Thank you very much for that, Patience. It's really interesting, and the discussion too. I wanted to ask you a bit about the intergenerational aspects of what you're observing and writing about, because your title and the word order, it conjures up two sort of contrasting images. On the one hand, the positive of stability and coherence and cohesion. On the other, it can be hierarchical and oppressive to have order. And how you see those terms may depend to some extent on where you are in a generational hierarchy. And I wondered if you could say something about intergenerational change and tensions, and how the personal and the political are seen through intergenerational change, and particularly in relation to the idea that people were talking about earlier, nostalgia for the past or hope for the future, and are they in tension?
That became, it was really was sort of fascinating to sort of talk to different Copperbelt residents across sort of different generations. And what was striking was sort of also the multiple stories within sort of generations that sort of varied. So for some of the older Copperbelt residents who had grown up at the cusp of when Zambia became a one-party state, but still had this sort of like welfare largesse, they formed part of the sort of heavy critical voice towards the Second Republic, the Kaunda era's policies, when the economy started going into decline, and sort of in effect sort of set the context of the sort of Ferguson era work on sort of the expectations of modernity. And so later, like in sort of speaking to them, they formed a sort of, this within that you have the gendered dimension within that, where you have this sort of a heavy critique that when austerity was initially introduced in the mid 1980s and onwards, it was consumption patterns, leisurely lifestyles, being able to buy new cars and all of that thing that got affected. And for women who were not so integrated within the mining economy, it was also about having to sort of stand up in queues and lines and all. For the younger sort of middle level generation, the generation after, it was very much about who they'd never really sort of experienced the height of the welfare largesse. And it's the critique of the post-privatization period was effectively, they saw it, some of them saw it as an end to the kind of experimentation in national self-sufficiency that had been embarked on during that particular period of economic decline. For the much younger generation, sort of born post-90s and all, crisis is largely most of what they had known and all. But for their perspective is that they commented more on the sort of social recreational activities, the aspect of dealing with death and the loss of family members that I talk about in particular, I think it's in chapter 6. And all, where within the context when austerity and neoliberal structural adjustment policies happened, it was also within a context of an HIV/AIDS pandemic. And so their sense of a society in decline was more like a society in disorder, not necessarily in relation to a past, but in relation to an ongoing condition.
Thank you, Patience and Catherine. There's a question in the chat, which you can probably also see, Patience, from Christian Straube. And he's asking about Ferguson's notions of dependence and as opening up opportunities, and how does that speak to your field work? And he relates it to his work in Mpata Matu on the former corporate social welfare buildings. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, because I mean, what I found is that dependence is, and this is where sort of senses that for Copperbelt residents and in the way that they sort of describe the activities, dependence would be sort of quite fixed a category. They would see it more as sort of relation making, or to draw from people like René de Visch, as sort of a border linking across sort of to sort of open up and make possibilities and opportunities for relations, whether it's for the prospects of work, of jobs, but beyond sort of work and jobs, it's really also very much about the sort of relational aspect of building knowledge. Copperbelt residents, in the way that they sort of sought to make and interconnect to others and people and ideas, was very much the setting of somebody really being an apprentice as well within a sort of social setting. So you learn not just about your environment within which you're opening, but you're also learning about new skills, new networks and all. But it also does speak to the political in a call effectively for the sense, and this comes up through the moral narrative that that politically people draw attention to their condition and their situation, and there again, rather than dependence, which sort of implies a quite one-way directional kind of movement, I would say that more of what I observed, particularly when people went about trying to set up businesses and to set up activities, it was very much within the context of people seeking to know and expand knowledge, but at the same time also drawing others into learning about their situation too.
Thank you very much, Patience. We have about 10 minutes left of the seminar, and we have a hand up from Alex Caramento. And I'm asking you to unmute. Great, you're there.
Hi, Patience. I got a question. Did you do any follow-up with some of your the people you spoke to during your dissertation for the upcoming book, like, you know, in Luancha, about how things have sort of progressed? I mean, after CNMC, the Chinese take over the mine, there's some degree of stability in Luancha, or even in the townships in Roan and Patamatu. Did you get a sense that there was a new type of order? Not obviously an order, you know, the ZM days and the corporate paternalism or welfare system, as you mentioned, but is there a new type of order? And the only reason I ask is, I remember going to Luancha in 2015 and asking people, you know, for example, with what a local politician, Chishimba Kwambuli, was doing with the Gulf estate, and, you know, well, you know, he's divvying it up and he's turning it into housing plots. Do you guys have a problem with that? And they just kind of shrugged and go, well, that's just the way things are now. Is there a kind of an acceptance of this post order? Is there a new order is what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, my sense actually, like when I followed up, I mean, there was variation, one in outcomes and experiences for some informants. For some informants, there was definitely improvement and some sense of settlement or stability to some extent, particularly during the years when copper prices picked up again. For others, the outcome was terrible. Things didn't improve much and hadn't changed much. There was also a sense of, in the informal copper mining economy, there was a sense of a consolidation of political consensus around organizing and creating a much stronger political voice as a stronger political constituency. That even there sort of might be following sort of a variation of currents. So on one hand, whereas some informants had seen some of the informal mining activities in a much more sort of benevolent light and actually portraying them as sort of popular heroes, for others, it was consolidating much more into, well, this is consolidating into some kind of criminal gang. Others were seeing that sort of constituency as effectively providing an anchor to sort of a critical voice around sort of natural resource governance in this setting. So there has been some change, and I also did get a sense of resignation in some parts too.
Thank you, Patience, and thanks, Alex. Christian also said, thanks very much for your answer to you, Patience. Are there any more questions? Divine has his hand up. So Divine. Oops.
Hi, Patience, and thank
Divine.
you for a really fascinating paper and for a very good talk. Ralph, I'm not putting on my monitor because I'm with the kids, so.
Okay, no worries.
But I want to follow up also on, I think, some of the stuff that many of the other colleagues have spoken about, and I think at least you partly pointed to that and others. First is just the notion of nostalgia. I think it would be great if you could just revisit that, just to try to reflect on it a little bit and how that relates to us different from hope, and why this is nostalgia, and why you frame this as nostalgia, and what makes it nostalgia. And then the second, which is about order. It's also, is it a nostalgia for a time when disorder was certain, or is it that our disorders have become more uncertain? Or is it just a nostalgia for something stable that was regulated? Thank you.
Okay.
And I like the story, the land. I mean, the story of you trying to buy the house and the land, and just trying to show, you know, how this unfolds. Thanks.
All right. Yeah, and I mean, it's, I mean, in the context of, with the first part is that the Zambian copper belt in itself, I think, sort of provides a sort of interesting microcosm of, I guess, sort of middle class formation, or it did, up until sort of privatization, and it sort of just disrupted it. Most people worked for the mines, you know, they would have expected, you had like, at the time of doing field work, you'd have had about 3 generations of copper belt families and mine workers who had worked effectively through the mine. So you had this sort of relative continuity within a sort of industrial setting, where you had, you know, from the 1920s, 30s, you had people worked on the mines, retired, their children took up work in the mines, and in the 1950s, with the expansion of a sort of this sort of corporate welfare, would have had several other prospects. I mean, largely connected with mining, but also within this setting. And in the post-independence period, in particular with the sort of expansion of social spending, you had, to a significant extent, a consolidation that people described quite well in the sort of rhythm and structure of life in the times that people went to work, the time that they had recreational facilities. And many Copper Belt residents would describe this, and they would also link that into the existing buildings that are there within the environment, which in the sort of privatized context sort of shifted and changed use. So, you know, so the squash club, for example, at the main recreational center becomes like a drinking place. I know the cinema becomes like a Pentecostal church. So you have this sort of wide variety of different activities within this setting. And it's these sort of changed itineraries and changed lifestyles that are no longer sort of so certain or regulated in the way that sort of people expected, that shift. And so it's linked, so the sense of the past and nostalgia is grounded and remembered actually within the sort of, within the same material environment, in the markers of buildings that have changed use, that have become run down, but also in sort of in people's changed lifestyle. So nostalgia becomes several things. It becomes an anchor to describe a past rhythms and changing texture. It also becomes a structure of feeling that describes a sense, in particular for younger generations, a sense of disorderliness in life. The whole idea that to some extent disorderliness, but also possibilities at the same time. And so it links in also to the kinds of stories that people tell about space that are shared. So and this sort of links into also how historical memory is reenacted and comes up. So nostalgia is multi-layered. It also links into the possibilities of the future, which again also sort of anchors into stories of this is what the Copper Belt was like before, this is possibly what it might be, and it comes up politically when people call for, when they critique mining companies for not spending enough on housing, on social services, on hospitals, in training a new cadre of mining engineers, in not paying enough taxes, for example.
Thank you very much, Patience. We're now at 6 o'clock, so that's been a really engaged audience and a very enjoyable hour for the seminar. So thank you very much for your contribution, Patience. It's great to hear from you. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to the book coming out in October on University of Michigan Press. This has been an entire seminar series at HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa. And next session, this time next week, is going to be Lisa Ackerson, who is talking about her work in Mozambique. So we look forward to Lisa's presentation next week. And in 3 weeks' time is Eliseo Makamo, who you heard from during this discussion session. So 3 weeks' time, we'll hear from Eliseo at Basel University. Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rolf, and thank you, everybody, for all the engaging questions. And it's been a pleasure. Bye.